This is an introduction to Let's Talk About Risk, a relative size activity appropriate for elementary school students or as a warm-up to other lessons for middle or high school students. So we created these lessons as PowerPoint so that teachers could go ahead and just open them and use them after briefly reviewing. The first slide has Common Core standards, which go from 1st to 5th grade. Our student objective, which is the same for all three lessons, is to use the real-world context of risk to find and interpret relative size between two quantities. If you notice down here, there are going to be notes for the teachers in every single slide. I encourage you to look through them before you give the lesson so that you think about the way in which the lesson should play out in your classroom. We have a word bank so you can talk about some important vocabulary before you start the lesson. There's a couple of slides about talking about risk with young kids. And then we introduce the big idea, the times as much comparison. Multiplicative comparisons are really important for thinking mathematically and for making comparisons of risk. They're also not always emphasized enough in the curriculum. The Common Core standards do make an attempt to emphasize them more. So here's an example to do first with the students to say 10 is how many times as much as 2. They should be able to say 5. Now, if you are teaching 2nd grade or the beginning of 3rd grade, you can just stop there and you can go ahead and just go through the PowerPoint and delete the gray answers. But if you are teaching above, this is a perfect time to talk about unit fractions because a fraction really is demonstrating a multiplicative comparison. If 10 is 5 times as much as 2, 2 is 1/5 times as much as 10. So instead of just thinking about 1/5 as an amount of something, we can also start thinking about fractions as representing multiplicative comparisons. And then we move on to asking them to use the fingers to measure the bars. So you can see here that a student might be able to use their fingers on either side of the blue and then iterate that to find that the red bar is 3 times as long as the blue bar. And for the older students, therefore, the blue bar is 1/3 times as long as the red bar. So now you've talked to your students about the concept of the times as long as. Now we're going to use that in the real world context of thinking about risks relating to COVID and other risks. If you're working with students digitally, you can ask them to just use their individual screen. If you're working with them in person and they don't have one-to-one devices, then you can use the handout. This is what the handout looks like. It's 2 pages, front and back. And it has the different bars for both the practice problems and then the relative risk problems printed so that the children can physically use their fingers to compare the lengths of the shorter and longer bars. So they'll get a handout that has these things printed on it. For example, comparing 1 Everest climb and 500 skydives. And they'll have to use their fingers to compare, come up with an estimate. After that, you can go ahead and give the exact answer. Now, it's very important that at the end of every slide, we have a discussion question. The point is not just to make these multiplicative comparisons and end there, but then for the students to think about what that tells them and what kind of information they've learned from making that comparison. We then have comparing COVID-19 to driving 35,000 miles. And ask the kids to discuss, did this surprise you? Why or why not? If you want, if you have the time and the technology, you can have your elementary students go onto computers, go to the website for the tool and start exploring it for themselves. They'll have access to many more options than are in the handouts where they're comparing things with their fingers. And then you can give them time to explore the tool, comparing risks related to COVID, life events like getting hospitalized for any reason, medical events like getting cancer, sports events like having an injury in a college soccer game, and games of chance like rolling dice. And we also have a slide where then you can ask them to pick any 2 things and ask them to compare the risks using a multiplicative comparison and what they learned by making that comparison. Another option is to move on to a social media post that I pulled from our high school lesson. We wanted to make these social media posts to give students a chance to talk about the things that they might be hearing their friends or family say on social media or in person. So here's an example of a post where you can ask the students to read the post and then discuss what they think Jordan's family should do, but then also ask them to use the relative risk tool to help them decide. So they're practicing using data to make arguments for or against a particular choice. We also have some final closing questions that you can ask your students. We have tried this lesson out in various iterations in maybe 6 elementary school classes so far, and we've gotten very good results and feedback from the teachers about how their students responded and learned from the lesson.